So now that we've talked about the main kind of parts, let's look at the retina a little bit more in depth, because the retina is the part that does all the heavy lifting. It does most of the hard work. So the retina contains a variety of cells, photoreceptor cells, and there are two different types. So there are cones, which are responsible for processing color and fine detail in things. And there are also rods, which are responsible for kind of detecting dim light. So if you've ever been in a dark room when there aren't any lights on, you don't really see color super clearly, right? You see a lot of kind of gray, black and white, things are pretty fuzzy. That's because rods are the things that are most active in dim light, whereas cones are active more in normal daylight conditions. You'll notice here that you've got 3 different types of cones. So you have green cones, you have red cones, and blue cones. You don't have a cone for every color of the rainbow. These are the 3 main ones. And you'll notice here, based off this kind of depiction, you have way more rods in your eye, way more green, gray, dim receptors than you do cones. So just kind of, this diagram in general covers a large number of steps as the light gets, through different types of cells. You don't need to know all the steps of this process. The only thing I care that you know are these different types of photoreceptors here, rods and cones. Now, although there are more rods, more dim gray photoreceptors in your eye than there are cones, there are a lot more cones right at the center of your retina. And this is an area called the fovea. It's typically, you see this tiny little bump right there? I don't think I highlighted it, no. This is a tiny little bump. This is where your vision is the clearest because it has the highest density of these red, green, and blue cones. So if you kind of see here, the center line represents this fovea point, and as you go left and right, you go farther distance from your fovea in the eye, and you'll notice that this red, the number of cones, peaks right at the fovea, and it drops off pretty suddenly, pretty dramatically. Whereas rods are, fill in the rest. There are more rods kind of in the periphery than there are cones. Now, axons from your cells that we talked about, kind of think back to the neuroscience chapter. When you have this information now kind of in your rods and cones, it's starting to be in a neural signal that your brain can interpret. So it's going to exit out of the eyeball in what's called the optic nerve, which is basically a giant bundle of axons, which we know from the previous chapter is kind of how information starts to be communicated and how information passes from one point to another. And this optic nerve is what starts to go into the brain so that you can process it. Sounds great. But if you think about it, this optic nerve right here is actually blocking a small portion of the retina. So the retina isn't continuous. You're kind of losing out on the little retina information right there. So I want you to think about, it's kind of like a fast food cup. So pretend your eye is like the cup, and your retina is like the lid on top. So the retina could be continuous all the way down. It's like when you put the lid on your cup without the straw yet. So the lid covers the full cup, nothing really spills out, it's pretty sturdy. But then as soon as you stick the straw in the cup, now you've created a hole in the lid. There's a little piece of lid there that's no longer able to do its job. It's open. That's what's going to happen in our vision too. So there's kind of a little hole in our vision where we can't see. We have what's called a blind spot in our visual field. Here's a little video that kind of tells us more about it.
Your eyes help you see the world, but you can't see this dot. No, seriously, if you close your left eye, stare at this crosshair with your right eye, and slowly move your head towards or away from the screen, the dot will disappear, revealing the exact location of your blind spot. The cells at the back of your eye transform light into signals that are sent to your brain, but they are missing right here because this is where nerves and blood vessels connect to the eye. So anything at that point in your vision you can't see, aka your blind spot. If we add a line through the image and you try again, you'll notice that your brain fills in information and makes you think the line is continuous instead of there being a hole in your vision.
Isn't that weird? So we actually don't sense or perceive every single thing in our visual field because we have a blind spot in our eyes because of this optic nerve. And as they talked about in the video, things like drawing a continuous line can kind of get around that. But there is a part of your visual field that you don't actually see. Weird. So now we've talked about how light information can get through the eye, through the pupil, projected to the back of the eye, hit your retina. Now information goes from rods and cones into this, optic nerve. And the optic nerve is what's going to carry it to the rest of the brain.